If you would enter into the wilderness, do not begin without a blessing. Do not leave without hearing who you are, beloved. How often do we do this? How often do we find ourselves faced with a difficult, harrowing road, a real crisis that we know is going to take some time to get through? We might even fear if we're going to make it. How often do we begin with a blessing that names us as beloved? Methodist minister, excuse me, and writer, the Reverend Jan Richardson, who wrote this Lenten blessing. For we're now 5 days into the season of Lent, which in the Christian tradition looks to those 40 days and nights that Jesus spent wandering and wrestling in the harsh desert. Talk about a time of crisis. Reverend Richardson writes, how else to enter into the 40-day place that lay ahead of him? How else to cross into the wilderness where he would have no food, no community, nothing that was familiar to him, and to top it off, would have to wrestle with the devil? How else but to go into that landscape with the knowledge of his own name and the names of all of those in his outer realm and midst, but to call them beloved? How else to enter? So as it has already been said, we are working with this theme of faith this month, renewing faith. And that's a comforting phrase to me. It suggests that our faith, as Lauren mentioned, is a shifting, evolving, alive thing. Something that needs reviving, resuscitating, maybe even, don't get scared, resurrecting. All of these words imply some kind of an action or motion and imply a kind of death. Many of you can relate to that. I'm sure of it. For who among us has not laid to rest pieces of their faith story? Some of us have buried things deep in the ground and never returned to the cemetery for a visit. Leave it, some of you say. No need to go back there. But faith, and maybe you know this, not unlike grief, has a way of not being linear, right? Our meditation hymn today captures that so well, right? Return again, return again, return to the home of your soul. And one can't return if you haven't gone out, gone away, right? Flitting away, being apart from ourselves. It's a part of life's journey. And so it goes with a faith journey, out and in. I believe, I don't believe. Lost and found and lost again, right? But let's back up here, because I've said the word faith a lot, and it's been just bandied about now from the top of the service. What exactly is that word? Our thousands-year-old, yes, Unitarian and Universalist history is rooted deeply in an ever-evolving faith. And at many points, this faith was articulated in statements that began with the words, we believe, which is a good way to understand faith, simply. We believe. What do we believe in? Our early 19th century Universalist siblings made clear, we believe that there is one God whose nature is love and that all souls are saved. Our Unitarian friends believed in the unity of a loving, perfect God, and Jesus is a wise man and teacher, not divine, human. Okay. And belief statements such as these were the creeds that bound these churches to a common lived faith. But Unitarians and Universalists were seekers, right? They were committed to an aliveness of faith as well, something that could evolve. And because of this, we can see how our religious movement arrived at its pivotal decision in the 1960s to not only merge and come together. It was at this point that we became Unitarian-Universalists, but that we began to openly identify as a free faith. For surely there are many pathways to this wondrous God or wondrous love, so many different suitcases filled with all kinds of different things, right? The Free Church in a Changing World was the title of one of the first documents produced after this consolidation. And it was published in 1963 following the work of 6 study commissions coordinated by this newly formed Unitarian-Universalist Association, the UUA. And one of the guiding statements in this published report was, in most other churches, theological quandary is personal. It is not institutional. With us, on the contrary, theological quandary is not personal. It's institutional. We have set at the heart of our church not a creed or a statement of faith, but the principle that theological questions shall be kept open. We therefore have no creed and can have none. Listen, this creedless, theologically roomy free faithness, it's what makes this religious movement wild and wondrous. And you know I love this word, radical. No doubt about that. But the theological openness has also resulted in a bit of adriftness. Do you know what I mean? When it comes to both a vocabulary of faith and an intentionally lived and practiced faith. That was a pretty full suitcase of principles and sources and affirmations, and it's wondrous, but it can feel like I'm adrift here. Where do I begin? What do we believe, really, though? And I need to point something else out here, fold this in. This is important. This 1963 statement and the majority of our bold UU statements across hundreds and hundreds of years that still inform who we are and how we function today have more or less all been conceived of and written by upper-class white men. It's real. And I want to stay with our exploration of faith, but we also need to carefully examine in what ways we've been handed a faith tradition and an understanding of faith by those who hold an immeasurable amount of privilege. Well-intentioned, many of them fiercely committed to justice, but bringing their inherited lived experience of white male faith and planting it right smack dab in the center of our movement. It does. It requires some attention. It informs things. I have to tell you that the time I dedicated this week to seeking out Black leaders speaking about the evolving history and theology of our faith, what we believe, the future of our faith, who have been published, it felt like a fool's errand, and it left me feeling really dismayed. This informs things. Because since the 1960s, despite the beauty of planting and building a theologically roomy and spacious invitational tent that I love, we have lost touch with a clear and evolving, personal, powerful, liberating fluency of faith. Just what do you believe? How do you articulate it? And what does it look like in practice? And many of our Black UU theologians and scholars, including the wonderful Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, some of you heard our very own Beverly Smith reference him in the recent service that the Social Action Committee offered. Diagnose Unitarian-Universalists' unspoken creed as one of worshiping individualized intellect and intellectual freedom. We got to think our way through this. Reverend Reed points out that this hyper-focus is a sign of privilege, and that the, quote, economically and politically oppressed often have more pressing spiritual concerns. Which begs the question, how is our faith or faithlessness informed by our privilege? That might take a lifetime to unpack, but I'm committed to trying. Our previous UUA president, our first and only Black identified president, the Reverend Bill Sinkford, he was gripped by controversy. Maybe some of you remember this. And an uprising of the most scathing press that even made its way to the New York Times, when in 2003, he wrote and delivered a sermon entitled The Language of Reverence, which called for an explicit need in Unitarian Universalism for a language that would allow us to capture the possibility of reverence, or to name the holy in some clear way, to talk about, quote, a world guided by what we find to be of ultimate importance. And he has been very open about the pressing, urgent need as a person of color for us to resist the urge to focus on religious breadth and instead turn our attention to religious depth. Yeah. For him, there are too many words that are off limits in our religion, and that we've been swimming, quote, in a shallow and vague faith for too long. And our well-intentioned white brothers in the 60s and beyond who made theological quandary something out there instead of something in here, well, because of our free faith, we get to renew this. Blessed be. We get to honor them, for they were stunning men of their time, and also reinterpret it and revive it and resuscitate it and maybe even resurrect it, but born anew, a fluency of faith co-created to meet this moment. A well-articulated, hefty faith that touches every inch of church and life in a practical way, right, that we can get our hearts around, that guides us in all that we do, how we spend money, what we buy, how we balance budgets, what we hang on our walls, how we govern, how we begin and end meetings, how we share in leadership and ministry, how we make decisions, how we listen, how we forgive one another, how we tend to conflict and hurt, how we care for our staff and this building, how we do justice both within and beyond our walls, have this rooted in a clearly articulated faith. It's there. We're not so far away from this. This is what Reverend Mark Morrison Reed and Reverend Bill Sinkford are asking us to consider. How might the Spirit, or a wondrous love, or fierce hope, a language of reverence, crack open our hearts and enable us to truly encounter in all of our affairs, not just in here, but out there, truly encounter the depths of our soul and faith, and in turn, the depths of another's. Beloved, each of you. The time of Lent, Jesus' faith journey, shows us how to have faith. How to have faith in the face of horror, right? Trust that His Spirit and our spirits can and will remain intact. And that no matter what, we are loved and love abounds. How else but to hold tight to this faith, this deep belief, this knowing, imbue everything we do with it against all reason? How else? How else? And I believe that this is what this moment right now, as Unitarian Universalists who are every day making history, we are writing it right now, that this is what this moment is calling for. And you are these people. I would not be here if I didn't know this to be true. You are a people of deep, soulful, loving, varied, wondrous faith. I knew it the moment I met you, and I love you for it. So I hope you will take the word faith with you this week. Air it out a little. Pull it out of your dusty luggage from long ago. Ruminate on what it means to you to consider what your language of reverence is or isn't, and how you arrived at that. And what would you put in your suitcase now? Do you travel with it everywhere you go? That's a good one. I don't. I'm trying, but I forget it all the time. Maybe it's a time to recommit to what's inside of it, or to at the very least begin by asking, what might I put in it? And I hope you'll talk about this with one another and ask one another some of these questions. Gosh, we get to know each other well when we ask how you articulate your faith. You might want to seek out Reverend Sinkford's sermon, his controversial sermon, A Language of Reverence. Or read up about the symbolism of Lent. Try it out. I offered a link to Reverend Jan Richardson's wonderful website in the Arbella, which is a treasure trove of resources. See if any of them speak to you. Or commit yourself to finding out what you people of color have to say about our faith. And I say it is time to make this personal. It is time to commit to this faithful seeking. And I promise you, in Reverend Richardson's words, that on this path there will be help. That on this way there will be rest. That you will know the strange graces that come to our aid only on a road such as this. That come alongside us for no other cause than to lean themselves toward our ear and with their curious insistence whisper our name, beloved, beloved, beloved.